molecular nanotechnology. This is the introduction to this whole area. The basic idea behind molecular nanotechnology is it is the physical underpinning for the singularity. It is that which provides the hardware for the better computer. It provides the hardware for lighter, stronger materials. It provides hardware for better medical technologies. There's a whole bunch of things that are coming where we need to have better capabilities in terms of building things, and that's the basic purpose of molecular nanotechnology, is to provide the physical basis on which a lot of this stuff then proceeds forward and takes advantage of it. So, what we will be talking about, I should also go into a meta-observation, which is we normally do these things in a very interactive style. So you want to ask questions, you ask questions, and we talk and we discuss. What we talk about is up to you. How fast we go is up to you. Basically, this course is for your edification and education and knowledge and understanding. So you get to you're in the driver's seat and you can move things forward at that pace which you think is a good and useful and appropriate pace. So I just thought I'd mention that. So here we have health, wealth, and atoms. Really what we're talking about in this whole nanotechnology business is the relationship between things we care about, health and wealth, and atoms. How are atoms arranged? And if you think about it, if you rearrange the atoms in coal, you get diamond, which is a very valuable rearrangement. If you rearrange the atoms in sand and add a pinch of impurities, you get computer chips, which is a very popular rearrangement in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the computer industry. And finally, if you rearrange the atoms in you, it makes a big difference between good health and bad health. It makes a great difference between being in a hospital or worse and being up and around and happy and cheerful. So how atoms are arranged is very fundamental to all of the material aspects of our lives. And I thought I'd give you a picture of how things used to be, and to a large extent still are. This is an alchemist's workshop, and it shows people stirring and mixing and pounding and generally dealing with atoms in great thundering statistical herds. So we're dealing with atoms in a very approximate way. Now, what we've been seeing over the course of the last many decades or centuries or whatever has been a shift in this ability. We've been seeing improvements, and we've been seeing three major trends. The first trend is towards greater flexibility. We can build more different kinds of things today than we could in years past. We can also do it with greater precision. The finest feature size is getting smaller and smaller. And the manufacturing cost has also been plummeting. And you've been seeing all these marvelous straight lines on semi-log paper, or actually I should say curved lines, they're accelerating lines on semi-log paper. And those provide you with the idea, the numerical backing for this sort of broad statement that things have been moving along and these trends are progressing very powerfully. These three trends are also progressing as best illustrated in computer hardware, but seen in a wide range of other manufacturing settings. So there are various kinds of nanotechnology, and when you get out and you talk with people in the world at large about nanotechnology, there are very different impressions. So for example, a lot of people think of nanotechnology as nanotubes in plastic to make your tennis racket stronger, and you can go out and you can buy nano tennis rackets. Nano tennis rackets are, 10% stronger for the weight and, wonderful, and it's great marketing. And that's not exactly what we're talking about. Or stain-resistant pants, there are nano pants. Nano pants are a revolutionary change. They are transformative. In fact, I was at a session where people were talking about nanotechnology, and someone was discussing the nano pants, and the guy in the back of the room said, "Oh my gosh, this is going to utterly change everything. I work for a soap company, and detergents, and we're going to be, you know, if you don't need detergents, we're going to be wiped out. So that's also been called nanotechnology. You also have some drug delivery systems which are using nanotechnology. I'm not really talking about that. That's sort of the kinds of nanotechnology which are evolutionary advances over the existing capabilities. We're talking about the stuff this guy was talking about. Feynman gave a talk called There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom, and I got to ask the classic question, how many of you have read There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom? And all the hands go up. And anyone who hasn't read it, it is vintage Feynman. You will love it. It is highly entertaining. He gave this talk back in 1959, and in it he said, you know, the laws of physics, as far as I can see, do not speak against maneuvering things one atom at a time, building things atom by atom, and building things with every atom in the right place. He said that in 1959. He was right. People have been catching up to that idea since then. And from that comes this whole vision of exponentially expanding capability, comes the vision of eventually reaching a device, a tabletop device, able to build pretty much whatever you want. Can arrange the atoms in most of the ways permitted by physical law. That's going to have an impact. And as we move towards that, we'll see, you know, there are two sort of questions in this whole trend thing. One is, what is the trend? And you can get that by gathering data. And the other is, how far is the trend going to go? Is there a limit? Well, we can go at least this far. We can go at least as far as a manufacturing technology which arrange atoms the way we want. Now beyond that, I'm not a particle physicist, so I don't know what happens after that. I'm only willing to talk about atoms. But with atoms, we can go a lot farther than we have already. And that is coming in the coming decades. Now, to give you an idea of scale, this is a meter. It's your arm, right? If I shrink by a factor of 1,000, I get down to a millimeter. A millimeter is small, but you can see it. Perfectly reasonable size. If I shrink another factor of 1,000, I get down to a micron. A micron is about at the limits of optical microscopy, and there are things like red blood cells, which are a few microns in size. So the red blood cells coursing around in your veins are 8 microns or so in size, pretty small. If you go down another factor of 1,000, you get to nanometers, and nanometers are way small. They're a lot smaller than even a wavelength of light, so you can't optically see things at the level of a nanometer. Things that are a nanometer in size, well, 25 nanometers, you might have heard about a ribosome. That's a programmable machine tool, a biological programmable machine tool that makes proteins. It's about 25 nanometers in size. Nanotubes, if I can talk about a typical nanotube, there's a little bit of a question about whether I can do that. But a lot of the nanotubes you see talked about in the literature, single wall nanotubes, are on the order of 1 or 2 nanometers in diameter. And then when you get down to the individual atoms, carbon atoms, 2 carbon atoms are bonded together, and the bond length is about a little over 1/10 of a nanometer. So as you go below a nanometer, you're getting right down into the scale of atoms, and that's the size frame. We've seen 2 big areas where things have been advancing. And those 2 areas are the experimental and the theoretical fronts. And in the 80s and 90s, we saw this big shift as people realized that they could see and touch and move individual atoms. This was the experimental work. And the other thing that happened is there was a body of theoretical work that came out and said, we can do a lot more than just see and touch and move atoms. We ought to be able to build things. We should be able to build a whole range of molecular machines.
What's an STM?
Scanning tunneling microscope. How many people have heard of scanning tunneling microscopes, scanning probe microscopes, atomic force microscopes? Fewer, okay. These gadgets, I'll be discussing them shortly. These gadgets let you see, quote, see, unquote, right down to the level of individual atoms. Very dramatic new technology. So what's the picture? I like this Venn diagram. What we can make today is represented by that dot. That dot represents my netbook, the projector, the clothes you're wearing, the chairs we built, the shuttle, the Empire State Building. All the things we can make today are in that dot. That dot is not the scale. If it were to scale, it would be an infinitesimal speck that would be completely invisible. That's how far we are from a general ability to build things. What we want to be able to do is move into this larger space. We want to be able to take a healthy bite out of this space of possibilities. We want to be able to arrange atoms in most of the ways permitted by physical law. Right now we can't. Right now we're, completely limited. This is coming. There's no reason in physics why we can't do it. We just haven't done it, as Feynman classically said, because our fingers are too big. So what's the picture? Today, over here, we have a set of experimental capabilities. As time goes by and we pursue various lines of experimental research, this dot of things we can make gets bigger. We also have this today theoretical picture of what molecular nanotechnology can do. This picture has been built up. We have a set of core capabilities, core manufacturing capabilities, which we need to achieve by one technique or another. And once we have that set of core capabilities, there are a huge number of opportunities and products. And even during the development phase, as we develop these capabilities, we're going to see some products coming out. And I show this as a single thing and this is a profusion. Don't forget that this kind of advance, this product here, represents all the conventional advances we might make in the next decade or two. So it's not that this is a small thing, it's that this is an insanely huge set of possibilities. Really remarkably wide range of possibilities that's coming. And I always like to put this in. I'm a theory guy, so I like to explain why is it that theory is a good thing. Well, here's why theory is a good thing. If you don't have theory, you don't see any of these possibilities, and the experimental work you're doing doesn't have a context. Are you making progress? Who knows? If you think the goal lies over here, then moving in this direction is a good thing. But if you think the goal is over there, then moving in that direction is a good thing. And if you don't know where the goal is, or if you don't have a goal, then you have no idea whether you're moving in a good direction, a bad direction, an interesting direction. You just don't know. So that's one of the major reasons for having a theoretical understanding of what's going on, so you have a context. It provides you with a vision so you can move forwards towards goals and do planning. Okay, so that's the first part of the discussion. Any questions at this point? Anyone got any? Is this making sense? Too fast, too slow? Perfect, people love it. Great, we'll head on. All right, so how to arrange atoms? Well, there are two ways, basically, of arranging atoms. One is self-assembly, and the other is positional assembly. And we'll go over both of these. Self-assembly is common in biological systems. In self-assembly, for example, you have the self-assembly of the T4 bacteriophage. This looks like something out of an industrial parts catalog. It is biological. It is a perambulating syringe. And it grabs onto cells and sticks in DNA, and it'll self-assemble. You take the parts, you stir them in a test tube, and the parts have complementary surfaces that stick to each other. We also see self-assembly of DNA. In fact, there's been some recent research. DNA, you normally think of DNA as the stuff of life, the core thing that brings us above mere atoms. Well, okay, that's nice. It turns out you can also do more than that. DNA traditionally is an information carrier molecule which is used to store, genes and stuff. More recently, we've found that you can use DNA to build structural objects with shapes. And people have been building various kinds of scaffoldings and stuff. So that's some of the stuff you can do with self-assembly. Then you get into positional assembly. Positional assembly traditionally has been something we've done with our hands. We hold things, we position them, we assemble them. And in the last couple of centuries, we've been doing it with factories. We have robotic devices or assembly devices that hold and position things and put them together. It's a very flexible mechanism of building stuff, but it hasn't been done at the scale of atoms and molecules, which is changing. With the invention of the scanning probe microscope, we're now able to, as I said, see and touch and move individual atoms and molecules in ways that we couldn't do before. Now, this is a picture of an AFM, or atomic force microscope. In the atomic force microscope, the tip actually touches the surface. Well, all right, technically I'm lying. The tip approaches the surface closely enough that it is possible to detect the forces between the surface and the tip. There are two ways of doing that. One is you bang the tip into the surface, and the other is you hover over the surface and you feel the attractive van der Waals forces, which is very clever. It means you can skim over the surface without actually touching it, but you can still build up a picture of the surface. And you can do that because modern AFMs are quite sensitive and are able to pick up the very small forces. So we have an AFM, or atomic force microscope. One of the typical ways of doing it is you have a lever, you bang the lever into the surface, and you got a little mirror on the back. You bounce a laser beam off the mirror, and you now have what is called an optical lever arm. And the optical lever arm means you have a photodetector across the room, and a little deflection here goes woo, 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 and you can measure small deflections quite easily. So this is a popular technique for using AFMs. There are others. But the basic idea is you're scanning along, feeling the surface, which is kind of interesting. You can use this technology to look at single molecules. This is a recent picture. This came out of IBM Zurich. And they're looking at pentacene, a single molecule of pentacene. The image above is the image they got with a couple of false colors injected of a pentacene molecule, and there below you see the pentacene molecule in graphical illustration. Yes?
What do you actually see?
What you're seeing in this, they're using an atomic force microscope to get this image. So what you're seeing is the measurement of the force as they move the tip over the surface at low temperature. So this is a force image of the surface. And you'll notice they've got these things here. That's a carbon atom, and this is an oxygen atom, and that's carbon monoxide. It turns out that carbon monoxide can be made to jump to the tip. So they are using the trick of picking up a carbon monoxide molecule, which then aligns itself up and down, and it gives them a very sharp, atomically precise tip. So they can now move in and take that oxygen atom at the very end and approach and withdraw and measure the force involved. So you're seeing the attractive and repulsive forces between the oxygen atom and the pentacene molecule, and they're then plotting it out. So that's, yeah.
And I don't have to worry about any, smoothing out quantum effects at that scale yet.
Yeah, well, actually, the blurriness you're seeing largely is quantum blurriness. We'll be getting into this later when we talk about atoms and electrons, but the basic message is atoms have nuclei, which are point masses, and yeah, they blur a little bit, but who cares? Forget about it. And then there are electrons, and electrons at the scale of molecules are blurry because it's the blurriness of the electrons that forms the bonds between the atoms. So pretty much by definition, at the scale of atoms and molecules, electrons are going to be blurry. So that's the brief answer, and we'll talk about it more later. Yeah?
Is there any relevance in looking at pentacene versus any other molecule?
Not particularly. Pentacene is flat, so it's easy to come in and scan it, and it's big enough so it'll stay still instead of skittering around on the surface. And it's also got enough structure to it that when you come back with a picture, they say, oh yeah, that looks like pentacene, as opposed to, yeah, that's methane. It's an amorphous blob with no structure to it. You want something with enough structure that people will say, oh yeah, that looks like a distinguishable something.
It's a photo op, basically.
Yeah. I hate to
does
say it, but yeah, it is a photo op.
Does this happen close to absolute zero, or can it be done at room temperature?
Yeah, this stuff I think is done at around, don't hold me to it, I think this was done at 4 kelvins. 4 kelvins is convenient for a lot of this work because that's the temperature of liquid helium. So if you have boiling liquid helium, you get 4 kelvins. So a lot of work goes on at that temperature. Some of the work goes above that, and you can have varying temperatures. The breakpoints typically are liquid helium temperature. Going below liquid helium costs more. Liquid nitrogen is pretty cheap, so if you want to operate at liquid nitrogen, that's not too bad. The other thing about liquid helium is you have to have better insulation because it's real cold, and all of your equipment has to be functional at liquid helium temperature, or at least the equipment involved in the cold probe tip that's doing all the work. But cold is, if you pay more money, you can get colder. Yeah?
I'm curious how you measure, when you're dragging this across atomic structures, how do you measure that you've moved an angstrom or 2 angstrom?
You
Presumably,
mean laterally instead of up and down?
yeah.
Yeah.
How do you know what the
Yeah.
distance scale is there, and then how do you keep this? I mean, I can't even keep, my orange juice from rattling around the table. How do you keep a tip so steady and move
Yeah.
it so precisely and know exactly how far you move this?
They drift. Basically, it turns out when you're scanning, typically what you do is you have a piezoelectric device, and a piezoelectric device, of course, means a little bit of crystal, and if you apply a voltage to it, it wiggles. And the more voltage, the bigger the wiggle. So you can now take a piezo crystal. It's sort of the reverse of the old stereo needles in phonograph. How many people remember records? Yeah, okay, so they used to use that in reverse. You'd wiggle a crystal and it would produce an electrical impulse you'd amplify. Well, in the devices they typically use, you apply a voltage and it makes the needle wiggle. And that wiggling can be very small. It can be down to, a fraction of an angstrom. So you then apply wiggles to do a raster scan. And when you're doing a raster scan, you can now look at what you're seeing. You can get an image. And once you've got an image, you can say, oh, I see where I am. And then the thing drifts. So you really today, in today's instruments, you don't have absolute positions. What you do is, yeah, somewhere it's floating around and it's scanning, and I see something. And as the image drifts off, you tweak it and adjust it and move it back. And the stability of these things is, a constant hassle because they drift. And, it's hard to get these kind of photos. Otherwise, I wouldn't be showing it to you because we'd be awash in these photos and who'd care. So it is difficult to do. And that's generally how it works. Is there other questions? This is a whole new technology, so it's been springing up over the last, decade or two. So this was a very dramatic sort of illustration of the imaging capability. And then this was some work from 1990, very iconic. How many people have seen this somewhere? Yeah, okay. So basically, some guys at IBM Almaden were able to arrange xenon atoms on a nickel surface and spell out their corporate logo. This has become popular. You can get lots of corporate logos, well, lots, you know, a dozen or something, in atoms. And it's considered a classy thing to do because it demonstrates that you've got equipment that's in good shape and works and is really good. And in fact, we've been seeing some dramatic improvements. Oh, I should probably mention this was done at liquid helium temperature, so it's very cold. And it involved xenon, so it wasn't making and breaking bonds. It was moving stuff around on a surface. Here we have an experiment that's been completed more recently. This is from Costanza's group in Japan, and he is arranging actually silicon atoms on tin. So they have silicon with a layer of tin atoms, and then you pop silicon atoms in place of some of the tin atoms, and you can spell out, well, you can spell out Si. You can spell out Si, which is the symbol for silicon, in silicon atoms by removing the tin atoms and putting in the silicon atoms. And you can do that at room temperature, and he is making and breaking bonds. So this is recent work. Actually, their group won the 2009 Experimental Feynman Prize for this and related work. And it was a group, 3 of them in Japan, Yoshiaki Sugimoto, Masayuki Abe, and Oscar Costanza. But this is typically, when I give the talk, I take the latest dramatic illustration of arranging atoms on a surface. And this is the latest and most dramatic illustration.
Those other dots are just because they missed?
Hmm?
Are the other dots there just because they missed before?
Yeah, you start out with, up here, you see just sort of random stuff. So you have some noise in it. So you have, you know, silicon atoms here and there that, you know, you didn't put them there, but somehow they're there anyway. And then as they arrange it, they can remove and add and clean up. And it apparently takes a certain amount of work. I mean, obviously, they would have gotten rid of all of them if it were easy and simple. But it's a pain to do these things, and the fact they could do it at all is, wow, they could do it at all. It's very dramatic. Okay, so that's the experimental background. On the theoretical front, people have been proposing molecular tools. They've been saying, well, if we can arrange atoms, why not get a little more dramatic and arrange them in ways that are, you know, more flexible, more interesting, etc. And in particular, why not move off of a surface? You'll notice the experimental work is all in 2 dimensions. Now we need to move into 3 dimensions, and I'm kind of waiting for some experimentalists to say, okay, I can move into 3 dimensions in some fashion. So in the next, you know, 5 or 10 years, I would expect someone to step in and, you know, grab the cover of Science or Nature or whatever and say, here is, you know, not just a pattern on a surface, here is a clump of atoms extending into 3 dimensions, and it was actually built in some very precise way, so it will be some precise structure. In the meantime, we can do theoretical analysis and look at a wide range of tools. I'll be talking about some of these tools a bit more later. And once you have a set of tools, then you should be able to build some interesting molecular structures. So here are some molecular structures. These are theoretical. There's no reason they shouldn't exist other than they're hard to build. Once we have the capability of building them, we ought to be able to do it. On the left, you see a neon pump, which would pump neon through its core. It's got a little intricate structure inside. And it's been modeled using standard computational chemistry. On the right, you see a planetary gear. Bill Goddard's group down at Caltech has done some simulations of this. And again, it looks like if you built it, it ought to work. And on the bottom, we see something that's a little bit similar, a little bit simpler. It's a universal joint. And you have torque applied coming in, and torque goes out. And you have this gizmo that translates the torque without demanding the shafts be aligned. Yeah?
When I look at this planetary gear, what's the distance between like those layers? Wouldn't like the fundamental forces which is used before and to image them like inhibit that gear?
Yeah, so one of the questions is if you've got bearings or gears or whatever, we're looking at, you know, a fraction of a nanometer. in terms of the distances involved between surfaces. So they're going to be interatomic forces, molecular forces. They're going to be van der Waals forces, electrostatic forces, all kinds of stuff. And we'll be talking about those later. Guess what? That's coming up. And now the question is, do those forces muck up bearings and things? And the answer is, well, if you do it right, you can build stuff that works. Now, that said, there are a lot of ways of doing it wrong. So one of the fun things, actually, when you're doing sort of the modeling and designing these things, one of the fun things is typically you design and they blow up in your face. And you aren't seeing the failures, right? Because nobody puts up the failures and say, here's one that blew up. See it? The parts went flying in all directions. We had one like that. That was an early version of the planetary gear. We got it up and we're looking at it and the parts went flying all over the place. And I said, okay, that one doesn't work. But the point is not that there are a lot of things that don't work. The point is there are some things that do work. And if you work at it, you can actually get designs that look like they should work.
And your modeling tools let you model all those forces?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, we'll be talking about those very specifically. What are the forces involved between atoms? So this is kind of fun. And then, of course, if you can build sort of interesting stuff like that, you ought to be able to build little teeny gizmos. This is a robotic arm. And it's about 100 nanometers tall. And it's been analyzed and discussed in detail. We don't have any atomically precise models because it's got a few million atoms in it. And that would require some work to design and model and so forth and so on. But it's pretty obvious we could design and model and build such things at some point. There's the planetary gear to give you a size feeling for it. So the planetary gear would be maybe a small component in this if you happen to need that. Yeah?
When you talk about things blowing up on you, when you talk about things...
What does blow up mean?
Yeah, how does it appear to you?
Well, specifically in the case of the planetary gear, you'll notice the casing here is pretty robust. Originally, to keep the atom count down, we just had a band that went around. And if you just have a band that goes around, the parts slip out. So these planets, the planets in the planetary gear, started sliding out and things just went and fell apart. This one has a fairly robust casing. You'll notice it comes in, so it now will hold things together so they don't spontaneously fall apart. But one of the things you find out fairly rapidly when you're dealing with sort of molecular models and stuff is diamond and things like that, it's really well-oiled, slippery stuff. So it can pop all over the place and do entertaining things. There's sort of no friction per se at the molecular level. There are energy potentials and barriers, but things tend to slide around quite easily. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. If you have, for example, looking into the future, a nanorobot that would be a combination of different parts of like these ones.
Yeah.
How would that nanorobot be so precise to manage atom by atom?
Yeah. I love that question. That is a fantastic. That's such a marvelous question. I've got it coming up in one of the slides here where I talk about it. What about the position of that? It's thermal noise, right? It's got to wiggle around. And what about quantum effects, and all that stuff. So yeah, we got a lot of flack when we started talking about this in the early days because people said it won't work. Thermal noise makes it impossible. It's impossible to have molecular machines because of thermal noise. And we always loved that statement because, of course, it meant that living systems didn't exist. So it's very intriguing to have someone telling you thermal noise makes molecular machines impossible. But you're a molecular machine. You couldn't exist if thermal noise made molecular machines impossible. So, yeah. Other? Yeah.
The examples that you give look like things we're familiar with, that we can kind of recognize the shape that we've seen before.
Yep.
Is that because you're trying to carry us through the story? Do the mechanisms change when you get to this size? Things are possible there that we just don't have metaphors for
Yeah.
here?
That's a good question. It turns out that one of the reasons things look familiar is because we're being driven by similar forces. And by that I mean, if I want to build stuff using this concept of positional assembly, I need to hold and position stuff. And I need a positional device. Well, what does a positional device look like? There are a wide range of conceptually possible positional devices. It turns out this is a compact positional device, a robotic arm that can move things in 3 dimensions. And if you scale down and say, I want to position things, then, hey, guess what? It turns out that something that looks like a robotic arm continues to be an effective way of positioning things. And if you're positioning things in order to assemble them, then you're concerned primarily about the positions of things. So there are a lot of exotic quantum effects, and some of them are even useful and interesting in you know, computation and things like that. For what we're doing, it turns out an awful lot of mileage can be gained by looking at things that are conceptually similar to robotic arms and mechanical devices, because our fundamental goal is to move things and assemble them. So given the driving force, the results have a certain similarity, even though the scales are very, very different. So it's an interesting and complex question. And occasionally we get flack. They say, oh, you're not being creative. You should use exotic stuff. And the question is, okay, what would we use the exotic stuff for? And people sort of deteriorate into incoherence at that point. But it is a legitimate question, which is, you know, how come these things look like stuff we're familiar with? The other reason, of course, is that it's easier to convey ideas if they're familiar. So, you know, there's that as well. But I think the dominant force is just, if you're driven by the same set of requirements, you tend to arrive at similar conclusions. Robotic arm. Okay, problem. How do we make big things if we only have small things? If you're arranging atoms, you got to arrange a lot of atoms to build something that's big. Well, we do have some examples. So if you look around, you find that trees are pretty big, and redwood. At the time, this was the tallest tree in the world. Apparently, the record goes back and forth. You know, one tree gets hit by a lightning strike, and the top falls off. Another tree grows. So I don't think it's the biggest anymore. But at the time I got the picture, it was the tallest one in the world. And it illustrates quite nicely the fact that a single small molecular machine called a seed can, under appropriate circumstances, build a very large result. And it does it using a concept called self-replication. So you have a cell makes 2 cells, they make 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Pretty quickly you've got a lot of cells. Now if you program that process right, you can build big stuff. And there are, in fact, other ways of doing it. So there's also convergent assembly. Convergent assembly is a way of building big things which is probably more amenable to use in manufacturing. Convergent assembly basically starts over here at the left. You have teeny tiny things, and you double the size at each step. If I have molecular parts that are 1 nanometer in size as inputs, I take the 1 nanometer parts, I put 8 of them together into a cube, I get a 2 nanometer part. I take 8 of those, I put them together into a cube, I get a 4 nanometer part. At each stage you can double the size, and at each stage it gets bigger and bigger. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. In 30 doublings, you've reached 1 meter in length, more or less, give or take a bit. So using this kind of architecture, you can go from atoms and molecules up to large objects in 30 steps if you're using binary. You don't have to use binary. You could make a factor of 10 bigger at each step if you wanted to. But for conceptual purposes, it's easy to think of it in binary steps. And voila, you can have big things. The other implication of this self-replication, convergent assembly, marvelous architectures is that the manufacturing costs are going to go through the floor. Right now we have examples of self-replicating manufacturing systems. They're called agricultural products. Lumber, hay, potatoes. They're cheap. A potato is a miracle of biological machinery. And yet we think nothing of taking this miracle of biological machinery and mashing it with a little butter and having it for dinner. The reason is that it doesn't cost very much, and it doesn't cost very much because the biological molecular machines can make more molecular machines. And as we build our own molecular machines, those molecular machines will be able to build more molecular machines, and so the manufacturing costs go through the floor. Now, I'm not talking about design costs and licensing costs and patent fees and marketing fees and all the other stuff that goes along with making products and selling them. But once you drive the manufacturing costs through the floor and improve the quality to get every atom in the right place, that's going to have a big impact. So when you're thinking about the impact of a new technology, or in particular of a manufacturing technology, what you want to think about are the things that it can manufacture. And you say, okay, if you can, what about computers? What about medicine? What about structural elements? So the first thing we notice is that if you can get the atoms in the right place, you can make really powerful computers. Basically, you've been watching the computer revolution, you've been living the computer revolution. Well, we got a couple orders of magnitude more to go, and the pace looks like it's going to keep right up there as we move straight into the molecular logic elements and molecular memories. So you ought to be able to get something like 10 to the 24th logic operations per second in a computer the size of a sugar cube. That's a lot. And 10 to the 21st bits in the same volume. I was thinking about that. What is 10 to the 21st bits? Well, a CD, they're kind of old technology, I know, but CDs are, 500-600 megabytes, something like that. If you filled a football stadium with CDs, you'd get about 10 to the 21st bits. So if you take a football stadium of CDs and pack it into a sugar lump, that's pretty much what you got. Computer power is going to go up, say 10,000 Blue Gene supercomputers in one little sugar lump cube, all operating together. So today those would cost a whole bunch of money, but in the future it's going to be, it's a fraction of a pound. If you're selling molecular computers by the pound and you've got a cubic centimeter, that's not very much. You're going to be paying pennies for this thing. And another miraculous capability, this computer will be so powerful that it will be able to run Windows 2020 and it will be snappy. Miracles will never cease. High-density memory. This is a proposal made a couple of years ago to have a high-density read-only memory. You have a surface, and the zeros and ones are encoded by storing fluorines and hydrogens bonded to the surface, and then you have a probe that moves along and reads out whether it's looking at a fluorine or a hydrogen. And you get very high-density memory if you do this. If one atom stores 1 bit, that's good density, that's a pretty good storage density. There are a bunch of medical capabilities. Respirocytes, when you breathe in oxygen, and your red blood cells carry the oxygen to your body. And when you hold your breath, you've only got a little bit of oxygen both in your lungs and in your tissues. Well, if you have artificial red blood cells that can hold a lot more oxygen, you could hold your breath for an hour, which would be kind of nice. And there's some advantages to that, particularly if you have a heart attack. Microbivores, devices that would detect and ingest invaders, pathogens in the circulatory system. If you could clear out those infectious diseases more rapidly and more effectively, then we could eliminate more diseases more rapidly and cure more infections more efficiently. And finally, a chromalocyte. That's a device that is more complicated, but would selectively target individual cells. It would carry as a payload a new set of chromosomes, and it would remove the chromosomes that were in a cell and replace them with a new set of chromosomes pre-programmed to be properly set up for that particular cell. So these are the kind of devices that look like they're feasible and are coming. We're also going to have better materials. So diamond has a strength-to-weight ratio over 50 times that of steel. And as a consequence, if you look at various applications like the space shuttle, or pick your favorite aerospace application, if you have an improvement of 50-to-1 in the strength-to-weight ratio, and furthermore, the costs drop through the floor because your manufacturing costs are $1 a kilogram or something, suddenly a whole bunch of applications open up. Low-cost access to space, really powerful airplanes, very light, strong, durable materials. And it's not only critical for rockets and airplanes, it is also going to be useful in other applications, whether it's trucks or cars or ships or even just furniture. The 100-pound Cadillac would be kind of nice. And space, as I said, space, there have been some calculations. It looks like single-stage to orbit vehicles would be dramatically improved given this large improvement in strength-to-weight ratio. This device would be 60 kilogram structural mass. This is, it's your VW, right? You go out and get into your VW and it weighs 60 kilograms. Oh, and by the way, when you fuel it up with something like 3,000 kilograms of fuel, most of the weight in this thing is in the fuel. If you fuel it up with 3,000 kilograms of fuel, you can now get into your VW with a friend and some luggage in the back seat, and zoom, zip off into low Earth orbit. And if you run through the calculations and stuff, it turns out that it all works, and there's been a published article describing this. And that's pretty dramatic. That means, among other things, that space becomes accessible, and all these ideas of colonizing space, visiting space, space hotels, all of those look like, yeah, they're in the cards. What we've been seeing, of course, is we've been moving in that direction, and what I'm saying here is, yeah, the capability, we're going to continue moving in that direction until we actually achieve it.
So, does it mean that whatever we find in nature right now is incredibly bad and inefficient design?
I'd hesitate to say that I'm a bad and inefficient design, but basically, if you think about speed, the cheetah is an amazing animal. It can go along at 60, 70 miles an hour. The Saturn V can go faster. A jet airplane can go faster. Today, we have a monopoly, a near monopoly on thinking. And that's going to shift because obviously we're going to have computers that have a lot more hardware. I mean, this business of thinking using tens of meters per second signal propagation delays and multi-millisecond synaptic delays. Wow. So I hesitate to phrase it exactly as you did, but it is certainly the case that we can reasonably expect that future artificial systems will, in many respects, far outstrip their biological analogs. That would be perhaps a more delicate way of saying it. But you get the idea.
So what makes the current physical structure of materials so inefficient, and how can you think about what would make a more stronger, material?
Bag of water. It's miraculous. You can mill as much as you can out of, bags of water.
Like steel, for example, or something like, a more simpler material that you can do right now, and you say if we build it on a molecular level, we can make it far stronger. What is it that makes it that much stronger? Okay, in diamond, it's simply the fact that if you build diamond and you can have economics,
if you can build it inexpensively, suddenly what was once a very expensive jewel becomes a structural material. There was a shift like this with aluminum. Aluminum used to be very, very expensive until the development of the process for making aluminum that suddenly shifted aluminum from being this incredibly valuable material that rich people would use for their knives and forks to show off their wealth to a structural material you could use in airplanes. So we're going to be seeing a similar shift with regard to diamond. And also there are a bunch of materials related to diamond, whether it's nanotubes or diamond or things that are like diamond at the coarse scale, but when you look at them, they have very, very fine structure, which is precisely arranged to do some particular function. Those all become inexpensive. So it's...
So we do learn from nature. We're looking at diamonds.
Yeah. So diamond is in nature. We're gonna take those set of capabilities and use them. And the falling price is going to be a big chunk of what's going to happen. Okay, space, higher standard of living. One of the nice things about this technology is that it should have a big impact on how we interact with the environment. If you have a better technology, then you can have a higher standard of living while having a smaller impact on the environment. And this is going to show up in the production of food. Certainly if you have better greenhouse capabilities. If I can inexpensively build really good greenhouses, then that's going to provide me with much more plentiful, much lower cost food. If I can, yeah.
How far are we from getting, a significant amount of advance in hydroponics, agriculture, and energy with nanotechnology?
Hydroponics right now, you grow tomatoes with it. Basically, the Saudis seem to have a very strong interest in setting up hydroponic farms in the desert, and one of the big crops is tomatoes. It's a little bit marginal economically, but as time goes by, and as you drive the cost down for the enclosure, and as you increase the capabilities of the enclosure so it can have onboard computational sensing to monitor various conditions and keep them on track, then there's going to be an increased use of that capability and of that technology. So again, it's one of these trends, and the limit is pretty obviously, a box that you buy for some very small sum of money, or a box that's built by your manufacturing system, and you set it out and it grows. And it's the temperature is controlled, the sunlight coming in is through a diamond sheet on top, which allows the sunlight to come in.
And how nanotechnology right now, is it affecting this industry? Directly or not?
I wouldn't say it's directly influencing them. I would say that we're seeing trends in these industries, and we see that as those trends move forward, more and more, they're going to have precise manufacturing. They're going to have a better manufacturing technology to keep things on track, sort of like the computer industry. I mean, is Intel doing nanotechnology? Well, you get into this philosophical debate. Clearly, they are improving their technology as time goes by. And as you look at where they're going, clearly they're going to have to shift over to some more precise manufacturing technology. I mean, lithography is going to run out of steam at some point. Everyone always says that, and it always seems to be a year later. And it keeps on chugging. It's gone remarkably far. But you'll remember, I mean, core memories were really big until suddenly they weren't, and semiconductor memories were the big thing. So at some point, the old technology just vanishes as some new, better replacement just takes off. And these shifts, when they come, tend to be fairly big. And basically what we're saying here is, yeah, we're going to continue to see those shifts, certainly in computer technology, also in hydroponics, agriculture, solar power and energy storage. We're going to see continuing trends moving right along. Manufacturing, if you have an atomically precise manufacturing technology, pollution goes away. If you have excess sulfur, you don't send it up the smokestack. That's expensive for two reasons. One, you want to turn it into sulfur bricks and sell it at the least. And two, if you send it up the smokestack, someone's going to come by and say, hey, you're sending sulfur up the smokestack. give us, you know, a penalty, a tax, you know, whatever it is. They're gonna stick you with some fees for having messed up the environment. And if your manufacturing technology has the ability to arrange things very precisely at low cost, why irritate your neighbors? It's not worth it. You rearrange the manufacturing technology so it builds what you want, and then whatever is left over is turned into, you know, whatever convenient thing is least likely to annoy people or most likely to draw a profit. You know, bricks of sulfur, someone will buy the sulfur for something. There are limits and there are trends. Ray has been plotting huge amounts of data on the trends, and when you start extrapolating those, you start asking questions like, well, yeah, I believe the trend, but are we going to hit some limit? Are we going to cut off at some point? And one of the conclusions you reach by looking at nanotechnology is that, yeah, there are limits, but we're pretty far away from them at the moment. So we've got a lot of headroom. And when we encounter those limits, when those limits look like they're going to be actually causing problems and limitations, it's not 100% clear that those limits are actually limits. So if I say, well, that's the best computer that I know how to make out of atoms, well, what happens if you don't make it out of atoms? I don't know, because I don't study things that aren't atoms. But in terms of how much computational power can you get in this universe, there are people who think about that, and they come up with even, the limits are even farther away if you think about those kinds of things, if you ask if there are any fundamental physical limits. So that's pretty much it, and I thought I'd try to put this in context. This is the universe. The universe began here, and we've now come some 13.7 billion years, and we're now looking at what's going to be happening in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So we're looking at the very, very near-term future, the next century. So one of the questions is, and this is sort of an exercise in stretching planning horizons. One of the things people get concerned about are environmental issues, the climate. What is the climate going to look like in 100 years? And also what technologies will be available to deal with that climate and to change that climate in ways that we regard as desirable. We have an interest in that. And as a consequence, if we can develop technologies within 50 or 100 years to deal with that, that's good. How many people would like to see nanomedicine developed within your lifetime? Hands. Ah, yes. There is, that puts us right, how many people expect to be alive in, say, 30 years? 40 years? 50 years? 60? 70? 80? Ooh, good stuff. Yeah, the possibilities are you know, interesting. But yeah, it would be nice if we had this technology in that time frame. So, you know, this again is stretching your planning horizon out to more than the standard, you know, 2 to 5 year. Also, there's some interesting things about expectation prices. So one of the questions is, if we predict that energy will be cheap 20 years from now, does that have an impact today? In particular, if we predict energy will be cheap 20 years from now, someone who has energy in the ground in the form of oil, Saudi Arabia, for example, might say, you know, if energy is going to be cheap 20 years from now, we should start pumping our oil as fast as we can and selling it as fast as we can. Because if it's cheap 20 years from now, our oil in the ground is only going to have value for 10 or 20 years. So if everyone thinks energy prices are going to stay high, then you don't pump the oil. If everyone thinks energy prices are going to drop, then you start pumping the oil. And if everyone thinks energy prices are going to drop and you start pumping the oil, energy prices will drop. And then everyone will know that energy prices are going to drop. So you'll really start pumping all of the pumping all of the oil you've got, and energy prices will go way down. So there's these interesting expectation effects. And they also look similar to the kind of effects you get on, long-term compound interest. Are you going to get a 10% growth rate or a 1% growth rate? What's going to happen? So you get these leveraging effects. You also get shifts in national power. So when new technologies come in, a lot of times they influence who's on top. The British, for a long time, had wooden ships. And that was a really spiffy technology, and they were really good at it. And then the ironclads came in. And suddenly, other countries, which previously hadn't thought they could develop a navy that was competitive with the British, were able to move in and develop navies that were competitive with the British. So there's shifts in national power that take place over multi-decade periods that are interesting. Which is the end of the introduction, so questions?
I have a question on the energy point.
Yep.
Do you think nanotech in particular will have an impact on the cost of producing energy, or will end up reducing consumption because the entire manufacturing system will go to much lower energy intensity or for other reasons?
The answer is it will help produce more energy. So, solar is the obvious example. I mean, you've already seen the data. Solar is getting cheaper progressively, and that's going to continue. And we can see, obviously, if you can make low-cost solar cells, then the price of solar is going to drop rather dramatically. As far as the consumption, the interesting thing is that nanotechnology will make energy usage more efficient, which means it will go up. So as energy costs fall and as energy usage is more efficient, you get more bang for the buck. Hence, it's worth spending more money to use that technology. So it's one of these usual economic paradoxes. If you are more fuel efficient, then total fuel usage goes up because people live farther away from their jobs and they commute to work. So that's one of those interesting things. But yeah, I would expect those trends will continue right up until some basic limits are hit.
Can you give us, if it's possible, a kind of nutshell summary of Smalley's arguments against the kinds of things you just
I am restraining myself in my articulation of his position. His position...
I appreciate that.
Yes. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, Smalley announced that it is impossible to arrange atoms using anything like a scanning probe microscope because we have fat fingers and we have, our fingers are big and sticky. We have sticky fingers, therefore it is impossible to build structures. And furthermore, chemistry is like love. And because chemistry is like love, it is presumptuous of us to think that we can have reactions occur when and where we want them to occur. And these statements were articulated by Smalley and were sufficiently embarrassing that I think they sort of sank into oblivion. I think I'll be going over the reactions involved in the synthesis of diamond, and in fact we now have published papers which analyze the specific chemical reactions involved in the synthesis of diamond, which from a technical point of view constitute a clear contradiction of anything Smalley might have said. His motivations, I think, were primarily, let's put it this way, that article came out in response to Bill Joy's argument that genetics, and nanotechnology, and robotics would kill us all. And after that piece came, how many people saw the Wired piece, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us? Okay, so you saw that. Basically, Bill Joy was articulating doom for various reasons, including the development of genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. And as a consequence, the folks who were trying to get funding for the National Nanotechnology Initiative, including Smalley, regarded this as politically adverse. So the question was, how do you respond to a claim that the funding for research that you're doing, which is called nanotechnology, is going to doom the entire planet? And the response was simple. The response was, oh, no. Nanotechnology is a revolutionary technology that will transform the world and is completely 100% safe. That was the articulated position. And the simplest thing to do was to argue that you could not, in fact, build things using molecular manufacturing systems, that at a core level it was impossible. So that was actually what was done. And the reason it was done is that none of the research that Smalley was doing or that others were doing were in fact moving towards molecular manufacturing. They were much more focused on specific goals. Can we make bigger nanotubes? Can we make nanotubes using conventional techniques a little less expensively, or some other incremental and valuable goal, but something that clearly was not leading to nanotechnology. So they had absorbed the term nanotechnology because it was exciting and marvelous. They were using it to apply to their research because it looked like that would increase the grants. And then they found, oh, but nanotechnology comes associated with this concept of low-cost manufacturing and mechanosynthesis and so forth and so on that some might perceive as dangerous. Therefore, we'll simply dissociate ourselves from it. So it was a politically motivated argument that had no technical merit whatsoever. Yeah.
You might mention the Scientific American article where George Whitesides and Richard Smalley both had various arguments which we rebutted squarely.
Yeah. Whitesides pulled back. I mean, he left himself those outwords. Oh, it looks difficult. Oh, it's not clear. Oh, this area needs further research. He was skeptical sounding, but if you looked at his wording, he drew back. Yeah. Yeah, we've got it up on the web. I mean, when it came out, we said, this is wrong. And then we put up an article that analyzed it and said, here's why it's wrong. Yeah.
So Bill Joy wrote that we were doomed. Smalley said we were not, and Smalley was wrong. Does that mean that Joy was right?
Good question. Basically, the argument, how do I put it? Smalley's argument was a wholesale rejection of sort of any advanced technology. Look at it this way. Think about a couple of cavemen arguing about fire, right? And one guy says, fire, we can, it could burn down our whole village. And the other guy says, nah, this fire stuff is impossible. And the third guy says, yeah, but it makes good food, you can cook stuff and it tastes, I really like this fire stuff. And you can scare off the bears. It really helps. And sort of the question is, how do you deal with this new technology called fire? Well, it turns out fire is dangerous. You can burn down villages. And we've got fire departments for the very explicit purpose of making sure our village does not get burned down. And we have fire extinguishers. And there are a whole bunch of rules and regulations about how you deal with fire. But we find that the advantages of fire, the benefits of fire, are huge. And the risks, when you analyze them, when you look at them, are risks that can be mitigated by various strategies, which we adopt, and we roll forward and do it. So I think that's sort of an analogy which conveys the ideas here. I think that if you look, and we're actually going to have some discussions on this point, if you look at how would you deal with new manufacturing technologies and new concepts, there are a range of ways of effectively dealing with it. But if you look back historically, all the new technologies were going to end the world. Fire, gunpowder. There was a big argument about whether that would destroy everything. Certainly nuclear weapons. I mean, we're still nervous about nuclear weapons, but somehow we managed to avoid the catastrophic scenarios, in part because there are a lot of people who really don't want to have catastrophic scenarios and think very hard about how to arrange matters so that the catastrophic scenarios are avoided. Even though one can imagine the catastrophic scenarios, they don't look like given the world as it is, anyone's going to let those happen. Yeah.
But wasn't part of the sad outcome of Smiley versus Drexler that Drexler said, well, we should build, we should think about fire brigades and things like that.
Yeah.
And someone has to spend money on it. And Smiley basically said, no, we don't have to because it's not going to happen anyway. And the end effect is that, at least to what I've heard, is that there's not as much money spent towards, thinking about building fire brigades than maybe we should be building.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. One of the things that's, one of the effects of this has been to block funding. Certainly in 2001, I think it was, the National Nanotechnology Initiative was going to fund, as part of its activities, it said, spend money evaluating the feasibility of molecular nanotechnology. And that wording was gutted. I think it was actually John McCain who introduced, I don't blame him, he had no clue, right? He was instructed to change this particular bill and did it. Sort of the political desire was to make it go away, and so the funding that was in the bill for evaluating the feasibility of molecular nanotechnology was removed, and as a consequence, there is, from then forward, certainly in the United States, there's been no funding for things that are explicitly molecular nanotechnology, and if you're out...
Except the 2005 workshop at the National Academy of Sciences, which we attended.
Right, which was the residuum of after they removed the funding, there was probably a certain sense of embarrassment that the funding had been gutted. So there was a workshop that, so that's going on politically. I think it's interesting. I'll be talking about it later. There's a guy in England who's looking experimentally at some of the mechanosynthetic work, and he actually got funding to do it in England. I don't think he could have gotten that funding in the US because he was pretty explicitly saying molecular nanotechnology, molecular machines, very interesting. And if you say that kind of things in the US today, I haven't checked it for the last 2-3 years. I think it's still something you don't want to say in your grant application. So I don't know how long that lasts. Eventually it's going to shift. And obviously people phrase it in other ways. So you can have tip-based fabrication. That's okay. Tip-based fabrication is fine. And you just use a different word, and then everyone sort of pays no attention to the fact that it's the same set of concepts and ideas, but you've changed the words, and that's a fairly popular thing to do. I think there'll be some discussion of prediction markets tomorrow, and prediction markets also had this problem. They were called idea futures, and as I recall, Poindexter decided they were a wonderful idea, and there was some work to investigate that, and there was a problem, political problem, and so idea futures went away, but suddenly prediction markets popped up, and prediction markets are politically safe and correct and don't do any of the evil things that idea futures would do, but somehow the core concepts were moved over and the research continues. Okay, so this is the end of the introduction. Gee, it took longer than I thought it would. What a surprise.